Good morning and welcome to Beyond the Headlines on CIUT 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Connor Fraser. Beyond the Headlines is a weekly current affairs show that aims to make public policy discussions more accessible. We take you beyond the headlines of our daily news and bring you access to current leaders through in-depth interviews. Join the conversation by tweeting at beyond_headlines. On September 10th, 2022, the Conservative Party concluded a leadership race and announced Pierre Poilievre as the third leader in 7 years. After a 7-month race, Mr. Poilievre won an overwhelming victory by taking nearly 68% of the vote on the first round, compared to roughly 14% for his nearest rival, Jean Charest. The face of Canada's official opposition has changed, and this will have important implications for the political game in our country going forward. Today, we sit down with a veteran party insider to understand exactly how the leadership race played out and perhaps what Canadians might expect from Mr. Poilievre and the Conservative Party going forward. My guest today is Mr. John Capobianco. And thank you very much for joining me on the show, John. To begin, I'm wondering if I might ask you just to introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us how you've been involved with the Conservative Party in the past and what role, if any, you played in this leadership race.
Sure, I'm happy to be here, Connor, and thank you so much for the opportunity. Currently I am a senior vice president, senior partner at a global strategic communications firm called FleishmanHillard, Highroad, and it is a firm that deals with helping clients and organizations on anything strategic from a communications perspective, from public affairs, government relations, as well as any social digital media campaigns that they may need. And my specific responsibilities, I lead the public affairs effort. So I'm a registered lobbyist for at all three levels of government, federally, provincially, and municipally in various municipalities. And I've been doing this for some 20 plus years. I used to work in the provincial government in Ontario some years ago, and then made the move into the government relations sector, and I've been there ever since. So that's my current job. I've been politically active for, oh my God, since university days. I went to York University and got involved with the campus conservatives back then. Got involved with the Ontario Conservative Youth Wing back in the day. As the OPCYA, the Ontario PC Youth Association president, and then obviously just kept getting involved at all levels of government, and ultimately ran as a candidate under Stephen Harper when the new party, the Conservative Party of Canada, was created, which was a merging of two legacy parties, being the Progressive Conservative Party and the Reform Party of Canada. And I was involved in that process as well, what was then called Unite the Right movement. Because if you recall, Connor, back in the day, there was two center-right parties that kept splitting the vote and allowed the Liberals to get into power. So a number of individuals started the movement to Unite the Right, which ultimately cultivated in what was the Alliance Party, and then what is now called the Conservative Party of Canada. So I was involved in that, ran as a candidate into 2004 and 2006 election, won both nominations, but was unsuccessful in winning the general elections. Obviously I'm from the GTA at Etobicoke, and just west of Toronto, city of Toronto, and it's not necessarily a fertile ground for conservatives in some cases, but nonetheless, that's a little bit of my history.
And so during the most recent leadership race, were you playing a part in any campaigns, or were you mostly taking an analysis role, coming onto local talk shows, appearing in the national media, that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, the leadership campaign started in May, and went right through, as you know, to September the 10th with the leadership election results. But during that time, the provincial election campaign was up and running, so for the very first part of the federal leadership campaign, the Ontario election was going on, and I was playing a significant role in my local riding campaign provincially. So I stayed out of the federal leadership race primarily because I wanted to focus on helping out my local candidate get reelected, as she did in the Ontario election campaign. And then when that ended, I didn't play a role because I was doing a lot of analysis, media analysis, and punditry work. So I wanted to make sure that I was able to do that in a way that didn't create any biases or any potential challenges. So I was able to speak freely of all of the candidates and of the party and of the process, in which I was able to compliment and do my work with all candidates without having to sort of favor one over the other. And quite frankly, I knew them all quite well, and would have been happy with any one of them, but very pleased that it was Pierre.
Yeah, like you mentioned, so much has gone on this summer, and it's so easy to forget that back in June we had the provincial election in Ontario, and maybe if we have some extra time, we can touch on that, because I'm sure you have a lot of things to say. And speaking about the process, just before we get into the substance of the race and what was said during the race, the policy issues and the outcomes, I wanted to get your sense of how these leadership campaigns work. What are the principles of running a good campaign? And is there an exceptional example, either good or bad, that stands out from what happened over the past few months?
Well, and it was a very interesting, it was a long leadership race, Connor. It was a very long race. As I talked about, May to September is relatively long for a leadership race. And also it incorporated, the ending of spring, the beginning of summer, and also the end of summer and the beginning of fall almost, in a sense. So you kind of crossed a couple of seasons, but and when you have a leadership race that's that long, it's going to get chippy. And as we saw from this leadership race, it was chippy. There was, as to use the hockey analogy, the elbows in the corner, right? And leadership races aren't for the faint of heart, because you're there to convince sign up members and convince members that you've signed up to stay with you and vote for you in a process that is it's not just a pure numbers outcome, right? Because we've got a system, we've been the party, the Conservatives have a system where every riding is weighted with 100 points. So, you got some ridings that might have 5,000 members and other ridings that might have 300 members, but they're all weighted the same in order to give some equality to the ridings and to the regions. So as a result, candidates were out there signing up members and signing up across Canada, not just in one specific region, because that wouldn't have favored them. So I think from that perspective, a lot of good things came out, because a lot of the candidates, the leadership candidates, literally had to go to all the regions of Canada and campaign to get members to sign up in their respective ridings. So from that perspective, I think it was good. And I would say, look, there was some debates that happened, that the party sponsored debates that were extremely chippy. For those of your listeners that watched it, you'll recall there's a couple of debates the two debates that happened were somewhat chippy, for this way I would say it. Others would say a different word, but I think that was necessary, because there was such a divergence of issues and visions that each of the candidates had in that leadership campaign. So I think from that perspective, you're bound to get some level of discourse and some level of disagreement. So I would say that overall, it was a really good leadership campaign, in that there was record number of memberships that were sold. The Conservative Party, I'm going to round up to about 700,000 members that joined the Conservative Party, which is not only is it historic in the Conservative context, but I think it's historic in any political party context to have that many members sign up. And they weren't signing up for free. Like, you had to pay, a nominal membership fee. But to have that number of members is an incredibly good story for the Conservatives and for Pierre, who obviously is now the leader of the Conservative Party, but also the amount of money that was raised by all the candidates, but most specifically by Pierre, in the millions. That makes the party and makes Pierre literally campaign ready, because obviously we're in a minority government, as you know, and a minority government can literally end at any time, notwithstanding the fact that the Liberals and the NDP have this pact or this coalition that is supposed to keep them alive until 2025. But that could end within the next year or two. So I think that Pierre having that many members that signed up for him, the fact that he won a resounding first ballot victory, and the fact that he's got millions of dollars that he's raised can easily be transferable into election readiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. There's a number of things that you said that I want to kind of elaborate on and pick your brain about, starting with the length of the race, which you mentioned was May to September. And of course, Aaron O'Toole resigned or was ousted back in February, which was even longer ago. And there's been lots of talk in conservative circles, in the media as well, about the length of the race and comparisons made to the United Kingdom, where simultaneously they've had their own conservative leadership race done in much on a much shorter time frame. So do you feel that the race was just too long, especially considering that the outcome was, a lot of people saw it coming from a long mile away? Was this just simply too long of a race, or what would you say to justify the length of this leadership race?
Yeah, I personally feel it was too long. I also, and having watched, as you mentioned, having watched the UK Conservative Party elect the Prime Minister, not only just the leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, but also that person, Liz Truss, is now the Prime Minister of UK. I thought was interesting because there's a lot of comparisons in a sense of how they did it. Not comparisons, but ways of saying, well, look, they did a good job of it. Why can't we do the same thing? Which is to have caucus eliminate, have candidates put their names forward, but sort of winnow it down to two, and have the membership elect the two members. Of the two members, one. I think that's an interesting way of doing it because caucus plays a big role. Now there's far more caucus members in the UK Conservative Party than there are here in our Conservative Party. So, but I think it's an interesting comparison to make, and whether or not there'd be any discussions about changing the rules. I don't think there will be. I remember the debate when we were once a delegated system, and when I say delegated system, where every riding we're allowed to pick, say 10, 15 or so delegates that then represented the riding to a convention where those delegates would then pick the leader. And there was a lot of fun and hoopla, and there was a lot of backroom machinations that happened, and it was all newsworthy, and it captured the excitement of the media. So when the party went from that to what we now call a one member, one vote system, which essentially is anybody that joins by a certain date is able to pick the leader. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. It's hard to then go from a very open, very very accessible leadership process that we have now back to a system that's a bit more regulated to a few making the decision for the many, and on such an important decision as a leader of the party and the future prime minister of the country. So I think that there might be some comparisons. I think that the system we've got now is there's always some issues with it. But by and large, it's allowed us to have 700,000 members, that have signed up and paid their dues, and that'll never happen in a delegated system, not to that extent. So I think it worked well. I was a supporter of this process of the one member one vote process. I think the fact that we've also got a weighted system and the riding where each riding is, as I mentioned, has 100 points. And makes it even across the board, does allow for the candidates to have to travel in every region of the country and not just focus on the ridings that might have the most conservative members in them. So from that perspective, I think it's worked well. But there's always some level of tinkering whether or not you should have it a bit more weighted versus the ridings that have more members versus the ones that don't. But by and large, it's worked in the past, and for Pierre, it certainly worked well for him, given the fact that he won so resoundingly with 68% of the vote, that pretty much quashed any concerns of any potential party division.
And I wondered if we could circle back to what you said about how is sort of like each riding regardless of whether there's 300 or 5,000 members, sort of counts the same? And you mentioned there's 100 points per riding. Is it that each riding there is a mini vote for the leadership contest, and whoever wins that riding carries that riding, and then all the ridings are tallied up, and then we find out the winner? Or is that 100 points per riding split between all of the candidates and then counted towards the national total?
Yeah, it's split between all of the candidates, right? So there would be a percentage that would be assigned to it. But I would say that for instance, in my riding of Etobicoke Lakeshore, and of course it was a mail-in ballot, which is convenient. It's a bit somewhat complicated in the sense of you've got to get a pass, you've got to get a photo, you got to photocopy your driver's license or other appropriate applicable ID. You've got to fill out the ballot. You got to fill out a couple of forms, throw them all into an envelope, and then mail it by a certain date, and then the party will process it. But my membership, my vote will be tagged to Etobicoke Lakeshore. So Etobicoke Lakeshore would have, say, 2,000 members at the end of the membership drive, and of those memberships that went into party headquarters and ultimately the count. I think in my riding specifically, I think Pierre ended up getting mid 60% of the vote. Jean Charest came in at, say, 15 or 25% of the vote, and then it was spread out amongst the others. So you would get the percentage assigned, or the points, if you will, of the 100 assigned, and then it's the first candidate that gets 50% plus one of the totality of the points of all of the 338 ridings that is declared the winner. And in some cases, as we've seen in past leadership contests, mostly, I think the last person who won it on the first ballot was Stephen Harper when he became leader of the new Conservative Party of Canada, and he was running against Belinda Stronach and Tony Clement. Stephen Harper won on the first ballot, not nearly as high a vote percentage as Pierre, but yet decisive and pretty resoundingly won that race. But since then, every leadership race has come down to fairly close numbers. Andrew Scheer, if you recall, when he beat
Bernier.
Thank you, Maxime Bernier. Won by just a slim percentage of the vote, and there was always some dissension that created after that. And then Aaron O'Toole, who of course came out of nowhere and beat Peter MacKay, who was then the odds-on favorite. Again, that was a fairly close leadership race as well. So I think that Pierre winning as much as he did certainly helps quash any potential divisive rumors of one side or another wanting to leave the party. So I think from that perspective, certainly none of that argument has been happening since Pierre's win.
Now, would you say that the rules of this leadership race advantage certain regions of the country above others, or certain factions of the party above others? Is there any substantiation to someone who would make an argument like that?
No, I don't think it would. In fact, I think the process is actually set up so that it doesn't advantage any one region or any one province over the other, right. Notwithstanding how small or how maybe conservative historically one province or one region has voted in the past, or quite frankly, if one riding has extremely higher membership numbers than other ridings, the system is built in such a way that, say you take a riding in Alberta, which might have, say, 15,000 conservative members, and a riding in, say, pick a province in Atlantic Canada, say, Newfoundland or PEI, where the conservative riding might have 1,000 or 500 members. In a normal race, if it wasn't the system the way it is now, you would instinctively focus your time on the riding that has 15,000 members. So you would spend an inordinate amount of time, unproportionate amount of time in Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba, because they've got the vast majority or the highest numbers of conservative members in those specific provinces and in the ridings within those provinces. So, but the system the way it is now is whatever the number of members you've got in one of those ridings in one of those provinces out west, it amounts to 100 points, right? So the 15,000 members in pick a riding in Alberta versus the 500 members in pick the riding in PEI, you're still going to get the percentage of the vote split given to you by way of points, and that's the purpose of it. It does allow for candidates to have to travel and have to reach every province of the country, which I think is right, is the way it should be. And and some in the West feel that it's not fair in some ways. And I've been at conventions where some MPs and others have tried to change the systems to make it a bit more weighted, so that if a riding does have 15,000 members, they should have proportionally higher number of points assigned to a candidate. But over the number of years and the number of conventions where that rule or that amendment has tried to get through, it's never succeeded, because the ultimate agreement between Peter MacKay and Stephen Harper, if you recall, Connor, Peter MacKay being the leader of the Progressive Conservatives and Stephen Harper being the Canadian Alliance at the time, when they made the pact to form this merger, the deal was the system that we have today was part of that agreement. So it is what it is, but I do think it allows for more equality.
Mm-hmm. And so during this campaign, there was a lot more traveling to far off regions of the country that might not have otherwise gotten as much attention. Is there an example that stands out in your mind of one of the candidates making a pitch to voters in a certain region in the country that arose as, or was incentivized as part of the system?
Well, I not one that comes to mind, but I haven't watched the race closely, obviously, and commented on it as a pundit throughout the election, throughout the leadership race. They went all over the place. There was not one. I think the party sanctioned two LEOC, which is the Leadership Election Organizing Committee, LEOC for short. The acronym is a subset of the party that is looks after the leadership race and comes up with all the rules and regulations and whatnot. They organized two official debates, and one was in Quebec and one was in Edmonton, if I recall correctly. So so they tried to make sure that the regions were represented. And I think every candidate, as far as I know, went to every province. Maybe some provinces more than others, but certainly there were events, and I was just seeing on social media events and fundraising events and rallies that were happening literally from coast to coast. So not one that sticks out, but certainly I think it would behoove every candidate to do the travels. Some candidates might have had more favorable responses in one province over another. So strategically, Connor, they might have stayed in one or two provinces, because they felt that that's more where they might be able to get some of the votes. And I would say probably some of the candidates that didn't fare well, right? The ones that were in single digits probably realized that, resources and time commitments and whatnot, that they probably focused, on two or three provinces more exclusively, because they had more of a favorable message to that specific province or region. But, Jean Charest and Pierre Poilievre, the two would consider the two top tier one and
celebrity,
two
superstar candidates.
From the beginning, they would have traveled to every province and every region of Canada, and I'm sure most of the other candidates did as well.
This is Beyond the Headlines. You've been listening to a conversation about the 2022 Conservative Party of Canada leadership race, and we're joined by our guest, John Capobianco. Thank you for tuning in, and remember to add your voice to the debate by sending us a comment on Twitter at @beyond_headlines. So John, before we continue with the discussion, and I want to get more into the actual stuff that happened during the leadership race by way of policy and outcomes, but one question I wanted to pose to you before we move on was doesn't this model where the leadership race revolves around selling as many memberships as possible to people who weren't previously members of the party disenfranchise longstanding members? And what are the sentiments and feedback you're getting from your contacts who are longtime party members, and really what incentive for them exists to remain engaged with the party when they know that whenever a leadership race comes around, your neighbor or sunshine members who might not truly be conservatives can just sign up and participate?
Well, and I think it goes back to it's an interesting question and an interesting debate, I guess, from the perspective of whether or not somebody who just signs up, it becomes sort of a newer member of the Conservative Party, has an equal vote as maybe I, who've been in the party for the last 30 plus years of my life, but I think that I would rather have somebody who decides for whatever reason that they want to join the party and that they pay the membership dues and they faithfully sign the oath that they want to be a member of the Conservative Party. I'd rather have that than the way it was before, where I'm somebody who's been in the party for 30 years, and when I say the way the system was before, the delegated system, where ridings were tasked that they had to elect 10 to 15 people that were then delegates to a convention. I would be more ticked off if somebody who's been in the party for that long, put my name forward to be a delegate. I didn't get voted to be a delegate for whatever reason, maybe it was on the wrong slate or what have you, and somebody that might have been a member for, say, a year, who was on the right slate, became a delegate, and that person then was tasked to pick the leader, and I had no right or no ability to be able to influence that vote or what have you. I would be more ticked, I think, from that perspective, versus the fact that, as a member of the party, I have a vote, and my one vote counts, right? It's like anybody that during general election campaign, where some people say, well, I'm not going to vote, it doesn't really matter. Well, it does, right? It allows you to be able to criticize governments and to be part of it because you were part of the process. And leadership election campaigns with one member, one vote is no different, where your vote, in the hundreds of thousands that have voted, but your vote counts, and you've made a conscious democratic effort to allow your voice to be heard and through a vote. So that system, I think, is far better than the other one, where you are literally you could be disenfranchised by the fact that you might not be a delegate, and therefore not even have a vote to who the next leader of the party is. If that you understand where my point is on that, which is better to have a vote, even though your neighbor might join, for the sake of the leadership vote, but at least that person signed up and became a member at a certain time, and was maybe convinced by a specific argument that any one candidate was proffering them. But at least they're now a member of the party, and they'll likely stay in, and some don't, but some do, and will become active members of the party.
So I'm getting your sense that it essentially democratizes membership and maybe broadens the appeal of the party to those Canadians who are conservatives on the margin, but might not, be involved in a day-to-day basis, but they still want to participate in the election and in the leadership race and have their say and pay their dues. And maybe that also helps with fundraising as well, with the party fundraising.
Yeah, in fact, I would even say, Connor, that it allows that level of participation where, the party had 100,000, give or take, a couple of thousand members before the leadership race, and now they've got close to rounding up to 700,000 members. So in the process of the election, the leadership election, which say it was started in May officially, but maybe even before that, to September, the party signed up, 500,000 plus new members. The party, when I say the party, the leadership candidates did. Well, that would never have happened in any other form of a leadership race, most notably the previous delegated convention system. So we now have 500,000 new members that came on as a result of the leadership race. Now, well, some of them, some of them were signed up for various candidates, and if their candidate lost, they'll likely maybe not sign on again. But the fact that Pierre won so handily meant that the vast majority of those members that were signed up were by his campaign, so they will likely stay on and support their candidate. Which, again, to your point, not only from a membership, perspective and convention perspective, but also fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a positive sign.
And so now getting into more of, the what happened during the race, in your opinion, what were the top defining moments of the leadership race for you and why?
I would say there's a couple. I think Pierre's campaign came off pretty strong at the beginning by trying to define himself and also define his opponents.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very smart strategic ploy that they enacted, because Pierre had a history within the House of Commons in his role as finance
Mm-hmm.
critic, that he would hold the feet to the fire of the Minister of Finance, whether or not it was Bill Morneau or the current Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, and even the Prime Minister, be it at a committee hearing on any one of the scandals that the Liberal government was undergoing at the time, or any other thing that was in general, misspending of government money or taxpayers' money. But Pierre had built a credibility or a brand of being this articulate, strong opposition critic. Well, he was able to carry that into the leadership campaign, and not only was he critical of the Liberal government, he was also critical of his opponents in a battle, as I mentioned earlier, where their elbows were in the corner on a regular basis. I think that was one defining part that was pretty significant in the campaign. I think the other one was when the party disqualified Patrick Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick, who was the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party for some time, and then resigned under some allegations of sexual misconduct that he had always denied. And subsequently, the CTV that originally launched the allegations settled with Patrick since then. But he resigned the party and then went on to become mayor of Brampton, which he still is mayor of Brampton, but then decided to throw his hat into the Conservative leadership race. And as a result of that, Patrick has a reputation of being an extremely hard worker, somebody who really does work with and partner with multicultural and ethnic groups across Canada, but most particularly in Ontario. So he was able to sign up a significant amount of memberships. We don't know, but Patrick's campaign claims he signed up about 150,000 members of the 700,000. So I think when the party disqualified him because they researched it, and they obviously found that there was some potential elections on Canada infringements or issues. Again, that is ongoing now with respect to the Patrick Brown campaign. Will deny that. The party is pretty sure that they have evidence that showed that he was contravening the Elections Canada Act.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, him dropping out of that race was a significant factor in the race, and did change the dynamic of it, because there was an unofficial pact between Jean Charest and Patrick Brown, where the two of them were working together, because for them two in their campaign, it was anybody but Pierre. So it was either one of the two, but as long as it wasn't Pierre. And Patrick, coming out of that, I think deflated Jean Charest's campaign, because Patrick had signed more memberships than Jean Charest did. So I think that was another factor that played out. And then I was in the debates as well, Connor, were the three major I think milestones of the leadership race that I think had a profound effect on the result.
I definitely wanted to touch on Patrick Brown, because Patrick Brown and Jean Charest were part of the more progressive wing of the party. But despite the fact that Patrick was disqualified from the race, Pierre still won an overwhelming majority on the first ballot, and the nearest contender, who was Mr. Charest, wasn't even close. So what happened to this progressive wing of the party, and what does this constituency do next?
Well, I think, the Conservative Party has always been an open intent party, and with that comes criticism. Criticism because there's certain factions of the Conservative Party that some people, will malign, like the social conservatives or the populist side of the party. But we've always managed to bring in as many people that are conservative minded, in a sense of making sure that they believe that economic freedom, individual rights and responsibilities, the opportunity to be able to prosper in a country that will allow you to do that and create a level playing field where everybody can do that, but a government that also helps those that can't help themselves. If you believe in those fundamental conservative ideals and principles, then there's room for you in the party. And whether or not you might be have one issue that you favor more than the other, that's fine. And so those that might peg themselves or label themselves as sort of the progressive or the red Tory side of the party, well, there's always room for them, as well as there are for those that might be a bit more predisposed to be conservative or small c conservative or more right wing, if you will. But we all get along because there's a fundamental basic conservative principles and ideals that we all believe in that carries the Conservative Party forward. And I think that Pierre certainly reflected one aspect of that, and more the populist kind of, building on the freedom of expression, freedom of being able to protest, if you will, peacefully, freedom of choice, women's choice, freedom of the economic freedom. Like, those are things that he built his campaign around and his brand around, whereas Jean Charest and Patrick Brown focused almost exclusively as the progressive moderate sides of the party. Both have legitimate arguments. But I think what happened organizationally is that Jean Charest's campaign just never picked up. Like, I think his arguments about how he saved Canada legitimately and credibly that he did, when the country was going through some pretty deep and divisive challenges, which obviously led him and launched him to be the premier of Quebec. Those arguments happened back in the 90s, when a lot of voters either were too young or weren't even born yet. So he was appealing and making this message about how he was the one that saved Canada, again, quite rightly. But people were saying, well, I don't remember that. And quite frankly, right now, I can't go to visit my friend because I have no gas. I can't pay for the gas. And I've got to make a choice between, milk versus, but there's a lot of real life challenges that are facing Canadians. Pierre focused on that almost exclusively, whereas, the other campaigns didn't almost exclusively. And I think that might have been the issue versus, whether or not it was a progressive versus a right-wing divide. I think it was more who captured the imagination of the voters that they were able to sign up. And Pierre obviously, had that in hand, whereas the other ones didn't. And then, as we mentioned, with Patrick leaving, most of his voters didn't vote, and the idea was that they would have voted. Jean Charest and Patrick Brown voters would have voted for each other 1 and 2, because it's a preferential system. You pick one, you pick your second, your third, and your fourth. And the idea was that the Charest Brown people would be picking 1 and 2 of themselves. But when Patrick Brown was disqualified and his voters stayed home, that didn't help out Charest at all. And it was reflected in the final results.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was shocked. I would have expected, like you mentioned, one of the two to pick up the votes from the other. But for whatever reason, maybe Jean Charest's message just wasn't resonating as much with people's day-to-day needs. But speaking about inflation and how people are struggling so much right now, which has been the focus of Pierre Poilievre, this has been his steady horse issue for the last couple of years since the pandemic started. I'm just imagining a world, and I would ask you and our listeners to imagine a world 3 years from now when the 2025 election comes around. Let's say inflation is back under control because the Bank of Canada has raised interest rates, the supply chain issues have been sorted out, people have forgotten about the pandemic. Well, they've already kind of forgotten about the pandemic, to be honest. Isn't this a massive risk to Pierre Poilievre for having championed this issue of inflation? And if everything sort of works out, the economy naturally works this out with the help of the Bank of Canada, how is he going to capture the imagination of Canadians when it comes time for a general election, having pegged himself on an issue so wholeheartedly.
Well, it's not to say that he's gonna stick to that. There's going to be a policy platform that he and his team will be able to build leading up to the election campaign. So it won't be just on that. But I think, and we're all hoping that inflation does come down and that the prices do come down. So even if that was to happen within the next year to 2 year or even 3 years, although tough to say that it will, because a lot of the economists and the governor of the Bank of Canada project this may be going on for some time, although they're trying to manage it now. But the argument can be made quite successfully that Pierre was the one that drove it. The constant attention that he focused on during the leadership campaign, and since then in the House of Commons, since he's been the leader of the official opposition, arguably can be said that created Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and his caucus and government to make the changes that they needed to. As we saw, there were some policies that came down this week where tripling or doubling, but he's certainly increasing the GST tax credit to families, and policies of that sort that are going to help Canadians immediately are good policies. And one could be made that he was rushing to make those because of the pressure that Pierre Poilievre put on him. Now, are they going to be enough? No. Pierre Poilievre has been saying in the House of Commons that there are a lot of taxes that are going to be placed onto Canadians that he's asking the Prime Minister and his government to stop the tax cuts, and hopefully he'll listen to that. So I think there's a narrative where Pierre could say, if the economy and hoping that the economy does progressively does well and that the inflation is under control and goes back down, there's a narrative that Pierre could say that, well, it's because he was the one that put the feet to the fire, if you will, of the Prime Minister and the government to do that. And then so that's on that issue, but there will be other issues too with respect to our foreign policies that Pierre is focused on, the ethics of government in general. Something that Pierre has talked about in general. Those will all be issues that will be front and center. But what happens today versus what happens when the next election is, be it 1, 2, or 3 years hence. There could be a whole, God forbid, there could be another pandemic where things get to a point where they were 2, 3 years ago. God forbid, but you don't know what's going to happen. But I think you've got a leader now. The Conservatives have a leader now who is articulate, understands the messaging, super smart, understands what Canadians want, because he truly went coast to coast to coast to hear what they had to say over the course of the last 7-8 months, and I think is ready to become Prime Minister.
For those of you who just tuned in, you're listening to Beyond the Headlines. We are a weekly public affairs talk show that airs every Monday at 11 on CIUT 89.5 in Toronto, online through our website, and across podcast platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This week, we are taking a deep dive into the 2022 Conservative Party of Canada leadership race. And for that discussion, we're incredibly grateful to be joined by Mr. John Capobianco. Have you enjoyed the conversation so far? Want to add your voice? Check out our Twitter account and send us a tweet at @beyond_headlines. If you have suggestions or feedback for our show, consider leaving us a review at Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We're listening. So just to summarize what you were saying there, John, before this short break, essentially, even though inflation might go down in a couple of years, Pierre is always going to be able to say, I championed this issue from the beginning, and because I was hounding so hard, and I was ultimately one of the key players who brought the government's attention to this issue, and Canadians will be able to understand that. And also there's a plethora of other issues which Pierre has very strong opinions about, that he's been very consistent about, that will take shape during the general election. I wanted to, just being mindful of the time, move on to talk about the issues that matter most to Conservatives, and the policy issues that Pierre has expressed during the campaign. I'm thinking about housing. Pierre has said he wants to get tough with municipalities to build more housing. for Canadians and make it more affordable. On social issues, he's been very outspoken about campus free speech, public broadcasting, immigration, climate change. I'm not sure what Pierre has said on the climate change front other than we want to get rid of the carbon tax, build more pipelines, and get our energy exports to international markets. There's a lot of issues there. We don't have a lot of time. Which of those would you like to talk about? And I'll let you add your 2 cents.
Well, no, and Connor, you did an honorable job in sort of listing all of the key policy areas or buckets that certainly were discussed during the leadership campaign, but I think matter to all Canadians, now. So not only were they debated within the leadership race in the context of the candidates and to the people that they were trying to appeal to, which garnered the massive membership numbers that the party got, but I think any one of those issues is going to be key in the upcoming election. The environment is one that is always important, and especially because as conservatives, and Pierre's talked about this all the time, not only, as a leadership candidate, now as leader of the official opposition, but certainly as an MP and critic, where he's talked about the fact that we've got this country is blessed with natural resources. And the fact that we can't transport it and import the oil from one province to another province to other areas of Canada is a tragedy. And the fact that we have to rely on foreign oil and foreign exports is quite a challenge, quite frankly. So I think that's going to be one where you're going to hear Pierre talk a lot about as well, not only during leadership, but during the lead up into an election campaign. The economy, I think, is going to be number one. The famous saying that everybody quotes from Bill Clinton, or Bill Clinton.
Is the economy stupid?
Yeah, Bill Clinton's campaign manager at the time, who said
George Stephanopoulos.
It's the economy stupid. Well, that's exactly right, and it's the economy when things are good, because you want to make sure that it stays that way. But most definitely when the economy is not good, as is the case here, where there's some growth that's happening, but job numbers are stalling, and the inflation is high, and prices are high. And I think that's what Canadians want to focus on. All the other stuff is important. Obviously, healthcare is hugely important, and what we have to do with healthcare, and that's going to be an issue to be debated as well. But the economy for now, I think, Connor, because we're so involved in it, because no matter where you are in life, or what stage you are, or what part of the country, when you go to put in gas, when you go to buy groceries, we're all affected by it. And that's something that I think is going to be critical in the lead up to the election campaign. And again, as you said, hopefully it'll turn to the positive as it gets on there. But the last 3 days in the House of Commons, when the House is resumed after the Queen's unfortunate passing, Pierre, every question has been on the economy. Mm-hmm. And not on the macro, but on the micro, like on the sort of the pocketbook issues, which Canadians understand and appreciate someone looking after them and speaking for them.
I'm just being mindful of the time. Do you have 5 more minutes past our original deadline to stay on? I just want to make sure I don't ask too many questions so that we go way over time. But okay, so now just coming back to the key players in the Conservative Party who were part of this race, who, aside from Mr. Poilievre, who were the biggest winners emerging from this race, and who were the biggest losers?
Well, I would say the biggest winners, other than Pierre, obviously, I think would be Scott Aitchison, who was a really good candidate. I think, he didn't garner a lot of votes percentage-wise. I think he was certainly single digits, probably lower single digits, but the impact that he had on the leadership race, he was an MP, a sitting MP, member of Parliament for Muskoka, was a mayor of a small town or small region within Muskoka before he became a member of Parliament. virtually unknown outside of Ottawa and outside of conservative circles, and even quite frankly, some conservatives didn't even know him. I certainly know him, and he's a friend and somebody who I respected. But Scott, I think, came out a winner, and I know that you're on a time crunch as well, so I can't go on too much. But other than to say, he just tried to bring some levity during debates and during the political discourse when things got really, really tense and hectic and in some cases, ugly. He would try to, remind people that we're here to be united. We've got one enemy, that's the Liberals, not ourselves, and added some levity to it to kind of, break the ice. So that was really and appealed to a lot of people. Obviously, it was a long shot from the win, but I thought he came out a winner. I'm not sure Roman Baber came out a winner or a loser. I think he, tried to make a pitch and tried to be the anti-vaccine guy that, said, I'm the one that fought governments to open up sooner than they did, but he kind of fell flat. So I would probably put him on the side of loser than a winner. But in Leslie Lewis, I thought, again, she had a really strong leadership campaign, Connor, last time when she ran in the Aaron O'Toole, Peter MacKay race, where she virtually out of nowhere came in third, and that launched her to become a conservative MP. And she threw her hat in the ring this time, but she didn't get nearly as many votes as she did in the first leadership race. So, I think there's a role for her to play. I don't think that she would be considered a winner in that regard. I think she was trying to do better than she did last time. So I think that's how I would break down the sort of the field.
And as for Mr. O'Toole and Mr. O'Scheer, the party's two most recent former leaders, they're still around and they're still active in the party as MPs. Can you tell me just briefly about any role that they played in this leadership race and what role that you expect from them in the future? Are they going to be on the front lines, on the sidelines? Because in the past, I'm remembering some conservative former leaders like Joe Clark, for example, that lost the leadership but then came back to serve on as an important ministerial position. So do you see any of them hanging around, or are they kind of out?
No, I would say that especially in the case of Andrew Scheer, he was all in with Pierre early on, forcefully, and made no bones about the fact that he was supporting Pierre from the get-go, and that's paid off incredibly well for Andrew Scheer. He's, I think, certainly part of the Pierre caucus leadership team, and I believe he's House leader and sitting like literally front row right next to Pierre. So he's playing a very big role and will continue to play a big role. So Andrew Scheer, I thought, did very well out of it. Aaron O'Toole, I think, didn't really factor in, didn't really lean in, because I guess as the outgoing leader of the Conservative Party wanted to play probably a more neutral role and stay out of the race. So I didn't see him getting engaged in any significant way. But again, somebody who's been an MP for some time, a cabinet minister in the Harper government, and a former leader, I'm sure he'll play a role in some way. I think for the leadership announcement that on the Saturday night, he piped in a message of unity and bringing the party together. So I think from that perspective, he'll play some role. But certainly out of the two, Andrew Scheer will be a far more significant player moving forward under Pierre Poilievre, opposition now and hopefully lead a government in the future.
Mm-hmm. And do you have time for one final question?
Yes, for sure.
Which was the curious endorsement of Pierre mid-campaign by Stephen Harper. What, in your view, was the political calculus behind this? Because a lot of people at the time were speculating that Stephen Harper was really concerned that the party could be captured by someone like Jean Charest. So was it out of genuine concern that Stephen Harper went forward with his endorsement, or do you see it more of just a more of a benevolent gesture between friends? And how much sway does Mr. Harper still hold in the party?
Well, I would say significant sway in the party. Obviously, as elections go by and time goes by since his time as prime minister and the party gets newer and newer members, I think his power will obviously dilute itself a bit. but still, he was a very successful, next to Brian Mulroney, who was prime minister for 8 years. Stephen Harper was prime minister for close to that. Those are the two significant people in our party federally. And the fact that Stephen Harper was able to merge the parties and bring it together and then bring it to government was not insignificant and a huge feat. So I think there's a lot of people. I ran under Stephen Harper, so I'm very loyal to Stephen Harper and still am. So I think his endorsement had a huge positive impact on Pierre. And those of us that follow conservative politics and are conservatives that have watched Stephen Harper, and not one person is surprised that he was supportive of Pierre versus Jean Charest. I don't think Stephen Harper and Jean Charest ever saw eye to eye on anything from a political policy perspective. So I think there was no surprise. Now, the surprise was that he actually publicly did endorse a candidate, whereas he might not have, but it's his prerogative to do so, and I think it helped Pierre quite a bit.
And with that, I think I would like to thank you for joining me today. It was a great, really insightful conversation, and as always, we really appreciate your time.
Well, my pleasure, Connor. Thank you so much, and happy to come back on if you ever need it.
Once again, that was John Capobianco, who joined us for a post-mortem analysis of the 2022 Conservative Party of Canada leadership race. You have been listening to Beyond the Headlines on CIUT 89.5 FM. Today's show was produced by myself, Connor Fraser. The views expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the producers, CIUT, or the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. If you missed any part of the show, be sure to check out podcasts of all of our episodes on our website, www.beyondtheheadlines.net, as well as on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Did you like the show, or do you have any feedback you'd like to share with us? Consider leaving us a written review and rating on Apple Podcasts. If you're a fan of our show or want to stay up to date, follow us on Twitter @beyond_headlines, Instagram @beyondtheheadlines, and Facebook, where our page is titled simply Beyond the Headlines. Be sure to tune in next week as we continue to take public policy discussions out of the hallways and onto the airwaves.